In a city where over 50% of our students are living at or below poverty, and over 70% of our students are students of color, so many of our kids and families were severely impacted by the pandemic. And now we're at this juncture in time where we really need to rethink about how we get to equity, how we change structural and systemic inequities, because this trajectory, the past 2 years of what's been happening to our kids, can't define their future. Before we dive in, I want to introduce the Ed Fund. I know many of you have been longtime supporters and some of you are new. So the Ed Fund was founded over 60 years ago. We are one of the longest standing nonprofits serving San Francisco community and our children. Our goal has always been very straightforward. It's always been about providing equitable access to learning for all of our kids. And we do so by mobilizing the community, the people and the resources to empower students, teachers, and families. Everybody knows the saying, it takes a village to raise a child, and all of you here, everybody in San Francisco City and beyond, that's the village for our kids. So Ed Fund is really committed to enabling, empowering everybody in our community to support our children for the future of our city. Since we've started, Ed Fund has provided over $8 million in grants to teachers and students. We have been committed to showing up to students all year over year and have provided thousands of volunteers to support over hundreds of thousands of students in classrooms. With the pandemic happening, we, like many other organizations and nonprofits, committed even more to show up for our kids. We pivoted and provided even more mindfulness programs and literacy tutoring from credentialed teachers to thousands of students. We provided 4,000 families with COVID relief funds, knowing that many of our families struggled to pay rent or provide access to internet for their kids to engage in virtual learning. We partnered with the city as well to set up over 80 in-person community hubs, so our homeless and foster kids in our city had a safe place to go to engage in learning every day with caring adults. So much of these programs that we do are a core part of what it's going to take to best support our students and level the playing field. And a big piece of what's happening is we really wanted to engage this community, to have some space with some experts that we have today, to have a conversation around this critical topic of education equity. What does that really mean? What does it look like at different levels? What's the history of it in our city? And what is the pathway forward? We believe it is so important to talk about all of this because what we're seeing oftentimes in the headlines is, what is happening today? And yet, as all of us know, the root causes for things happened years and decades ago, oftentimes in our lives, as well as in the way our city's education system has been structured. So we believe it's critical for everybody to understand that history as we think about how to solve for it moving forward. You'll be hearing from very compelling perspectives and different perspectives today, and that's going to highlight a point of inequities happen at so many different levels of the system that we're addressing it at varying levels so that we can provide a better future for our kids. So you're going to hear some of that come up in today's conversation from our panelists. Before I go into introducing our panelists and kicking us off, I wanted to take a moment to introduce Rob and TogetherSF, our co-sponsor of today's event. For those not yet familiar with TogetherSF, they are focused on increasing civic engagement and education in San Francisco. Rob, welcome so much and thank you for partnering with us on this. Can you take a couple minutes to introduce yourself and the organization?
Yeah, of course. No, thank you, Stacey, for that quick introduction. Like you said, I am Rob with TogetherSF. We are a civic engagement nonprofit here in San Francisco that originally started out of COVID response in March 2020, but soon morphed into a larger civic engagement project, basically looking to help residents, one, get involved in their communities and build up their network so that they're able to take action on the issues that are most important to them, but also helping residents better understand some of the complex issues and challenges facing San Francisco and providing them with actionable ways to get involved. So I'm really excited to be a part of this talk today and just be able to co-host with the Ed Fund on this conversation around educational equity. I think, in order to take action and make progress on these issues, we need to have a solid understanding of what barriers are in place that can prevent equitable educational outcomes for our students. And I think we've seen definitely a big change in learning loss over the last couple of, over the course of the last year. And I think we can all agree that a strong educational system is important in empowering the next generation, also just making sure that our city is a great place to raise a family. And that's something that we're really committed to, especially with myself expecting in June. So I'm really excited to hear from our panelists today and learn more from them on this topic and just be a part of this conversation. So no, thank you again to Stacey and the Ed Fund for allowing us to co-host today, and for all of our panelists for enlightening us on this very important issue. But with that said, I will go ahead and turn it back over to you, Stacey.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. And congratulations. June is coming around the corner. I'm just so excited to have an additional child in our city. That's amazing. So we are fortunate to have 3 incredible panelists with us today. I want to quickly introduce them and then run over the structure of today's conversation and then kick us off into the conversation itself. So Debby Lu is an incredible expert in San Francisco history, particularly the history of our public schools as well as public school financials. She is also a parent of 2 kids who go to San Francisco Unified Schools. Dr. Donald Frazier is on the equity team at the district at San Francisco Unified. He is a lead coach and supporter of equity initiatives supporting equity in the classroom for kids. Stephen Menendian is the assistant director of the Otherling and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley and the lead author of the Roots of Structural Racism project. We're so excited to have these 3 varying perspectives at the system level, the classroom level, the parent level with us today to give you guys some context around what equity looks like for kids from all those perspectives. Before I pass it over to panelists, just a quick overview on how the structure of this will go. Stephen's going to kick us off with about 15 minutes of sharing some data and research around structural inequities and racism and how that's contributing to what's been happening in San Francisco and nationally. We'll then have about 20 minutes to have a conversation with the panelists and ask them questions about how this is showing up in their work and their recommendations. And then we'll open it up to Q&A with the audience. If you have a question, please submit it to the moderator anytime via the Q&A button. So Debby, welcome. Let me turn it over to you. Could you take a minute to introduce yourself?
Hi, Stacey. I am trying to start my video, but again, oh, here we go. Hi, Stacey.
Hi.
I'm honored to be here with all of you today. Hi, everyone. My name is Debby Lu, and as Stacey mentioned, I'm a parent of 2 kids in SFUSD, a 7th and a 10th grader, and they've been attending since kindergarten. For the past 6 years, I've also been a board member of the SF Ed Fund, and through the Ed Fund, I've had an amazing set of opportunities to volunteer to support students and teachers and schools throughout the district. In my day job, I work as a management consultant supporting government agencies to improve their management and operations. And I'm currently also an educational researcher examining how philanthropic activities, specifically charitable donations, affect public schools. And like Stacey, my hope today is that we start creating a shared understanding of why San Francisco public schools are the way they are, the historical context and the policies and politics that determine which students attend which schools, all of which is to say that we can work together to improve educational experiences and outcomes for all of our kids. So I'll pass it on back to Stacey or Dawn.
Yeah, thank you, Debby, so much. Dawn, welcome. Could I invite you to do a quick introduction of yourself as well?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Stacey. I'll keep it short and brief because I know we want to get to the meat of the discussion. Donald Frazier. I've been with SFUSD for about 7 years. I've been in education since 2008 or so. In addition to being an equity and professional development coach, I'm a professor at San Francisco State University in the Educational Leadership Program. I'm also an educational consultant. I'm working with Richmond right now and I work with a variety of schools throughout the Bay Area around equity and leadership development. I'm also a parent with a student in Oakland, which Oakland are actually doing a sit out right now for a few days. So definitely coming with that educator, professional personal experience. that I also bring to my work. And so I'll do my best to bring what I see in the classrooms from SFUSD, as well as a parent perspective. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Dawn. Stephen, let me pass it to you to close out the introductions and kick off the data sharing as well.
Thank you, Stacey. Thank you to you and Meg and others who've helped organize this important event. I'm the Assistant Director and Director of Research at the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, formerly known as the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society. And in sort of the first phase of my career, I worked intensely with a number of school districts and school boards on issues of diversity, inclusion, and equity. So I'm really excited to participate and honored to participate in this conversation with the focus on San Francisco. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for the introduction. Well, let's dive into some of the research that you had shared with us around what you've been saying.
Yeah, education is so important. Aside from public safety and sort of basic infrastructure investments, I'm not sure that there's a more important thing that we do as a society than educate, our young people for life, for economic activity, for civic engagement, for citizenship, for everything that matters, for help people understand both the rudiments of knowledge, but also the rudiments of society, how to get along, how to negotiate, everything that matters. And unfortunately, across the United States, like many of our systems, our educational system is straining, much like our health system, like housing. And just what you said about over 50% of the children that attend San Francisco schools coming from living in poverty is both a tragedy and a shock and a serious problem. I originally said I wasn't going to do too much original research for this, but as I got closer and closer, I decided to dig into some census data and other data, NCES data, and I put together some original, never before shown tables and information that I think really reveals the scope of the problems and challenges that confront this district. So bear with me and let's go through this. The first step will be if the slide share works. So
We can see it. You're good to go.
let's test to see whether the progression works. Can you see this, the next slide?
Yes.
Okay, it says poverty and education. So one of the key findings in the sociological research since the 1960s, and frankly earlier than that, but one of the main data points is the famous Coleman report, is that there is a strong relationship between educational outcomes and school quality and peers. So basically, if you were to ask researchers and scholars, what are the most important predictors of educational success, either measured by graduation rates or test scores or ultimately educational attainment, they'll say that frankly, probably the most important indicator is the educational attainment of the parent, in particular mothers. But beyond that, right, there are a host of inputs that matter, right? Teachers, resources in schools, the quality of education, the safety of education, the quality of the curriculum, all of that matters. But the second most important indicator, generally speaking, is the socioeconomic composition of the student body and peer influences. I think most parents know that after a certain age, children begin to pay more attention and listen more to their peer cohort than their parents. We can debate where that happens, but somewhere in late adolescence or adolescence. And so peers, particularly in the upper levels of secondary education, play a tremendous influence. And in this regard, this is where poverty really makes a large impact. And so just to provide some key terms, by poverty, I'm looking at two thresholds. Generally, urban demographers, educational researchers, and sociologists peg high poverty rates in either neighborhoods or schools as 20% or more or 30% or more, depending upon the book or the journal article that you're looking at. But they label what's called concentrated poverty as poverty rates of 40% or more. And in neighborhoods, when you have concentrated poverty, there is a host of sociological ills that begin to manifest in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. And those, by the way, are also replicated in schools. Although, as we know, as you just said, schools tend to have more poverty than neighborhoods, which I'll point out in just a moment. But the general takeaway, the general finding is that schools with high levels of poverty, and particularly concentrated poverty, are almost always underperforming disadvantaged schools. So this is a serious problem in education. Also, it intersects with race, because racial segregation, which is the separation of students on the basis of race into different schools, that diverges more than the racial composition of a district as a whole or a region as a whole, tends to segregate students by class as well, and particularly by poverty. And I'll show this in just a moment. So just a couple of tables. I'm going to go through some tables quickly. This is an overview of race and poverty in the United States. And I pulled this from 2020 census data and 2019 ACS estimates. Basically, what you can see here is that there are about 37 million Americans who live in poverty. That is, that their families earn below the poverty line. But one of the things that's important here is that that's, by the way, 11.5% of Americans, using the definition of the federal poverty line, which a lot of people criticize as being too low. But you'll notice the childhood poverty rate is significantly higher at 16.1%, which means that children in particular experience poverty at a higher rate than almost any other group in the United States. This is devastating to child development and well-being, and what they call the investment in human capital. Now, despite this high level of poverty for children, the racial aspect to this is even more pronounced. So you can see here that white children, about 10% of white children, 1 in 10, live in families that earn below the poverty line. But almost between a quarter and a third, 28% of Black children grow up in families that earn below the poverty line, and almost a quarter of Hispanic, which means that poverty and race have a profound impact, especially on children, Black and Hispanic children. This is a devastating feature of American society. And in fact, I think this is probably one of the foundations of structural racism, along with segregation. But segregation then concentrates this. We'll get to that in a moment. So let's look at how this manifests in schools. This is table 2. There's almost a stepwise pattern, as I'll show in the next table, between the percentage of children of color and the percentage of poverty in schools. That is to say, children who live in families that earn below the poverty line. So this is the United States as a whole. And what you can see here is that in schools that are 80% or more children of color, that are only 0 to 20% white, the average poverty rate, and by the way, this is, I think it's almost, this is thousands of schools. This is, I think, 80, I think I want to say 8,000 schools or more in the United States. It might even be 88,000 schools. I think it's 88,000 schools in the NCES sample. The point here is about 3/4 of students living that attend heavily non-white schools are in poverty. But look at the other end of the spectrum. Mostly white schools, majority white schools, are only about 1/3 of students in poverty. And then here's the stepwise pattern. As you increase the percentage white, you decrease the percentage poverty. So here's poverty, 0 to 20% to 80 to 100%, and you can see the percentage white. Now, what I just want to point out here is that this is a highly segregated by class experience. White children attend these low poverty schools, and very few Black children attend those schools. But a huge proportion of Black and Latino children attend extremely high poverty schools. In other words, in the United States, Black and brown children attend high poverty schools, and white children disproportionately attend low poverty schools. This is a devastating development for child well-being. Just continuing to move forward, same chart for California, very similar findings. I'm running low on time, so I'm going to skip over California and go directly to San Francisco. Now, San Francisco has a relatively small white population, so there's almost no schools that are majority white, as you can see here. But in essence, there is a relatively similar finding. About 55% of students in heavily non-white schools live in families that earn below the poverty line, but only 1/5 of students in heavily white schools are in poverty. And you can see that here to here. So this pattern, even though San Francisco's racial composition is quite different from California or even the country, the basic pattern is essentially the same, although not quite as stark. And so here's the stepwise version of it, as you can see through the deciles of poverty. And what I just want to point out here is that a couple things. One is that this is the distribution of schools in terms of the poverty level. There are very, very few schools, as was mentioned before, that have extremely low levels of poverty. Only 7% in the San Francisco Unified School District. But those that do are a quarter white, even though I think it's only 15% of the school district is of the city is white. And as you can see here, the lower poverty schools are the ones that have the highest concentration of white students. So there is clearly a dynamic here where whiteness and low level of poverty is extremely correlated. Now, what does this have to do with whether the schools are racially or segregated or integrated? Well, it's complicated. This is a map from the Washington Post that has Washington Post a couple of years ago allowed you to search school districts to see which were integrated or segregated. As you can see here, they said that Oakland and San Francisco were not integrated compared to some of the other districts in the region. There's a wonderful resource called edopportunity.org where you can search up schools and school districts. And here's a screenshot I took when I looked at it last week that I wanted to share with you. This is using that tool. This is a map of the San Francisco Unified School District. And I zoomed into this elementary school down here in Bayview Hunters Point called Hart or Brett Elementary. And it has 88% of the children in this school right here on free and reduced lunch. That is, they qualify for free and reduced lunch because their families are very low income and earn below the federal poverty line. Yet when I click these schools over here in green, you'll see that they have free and reduced lunch levels maybe 15%, 18%, 20%, 25%, 33%. San Francisco is extremely class segregated. That you have these schools that are extremely concentrated in terms of low poverty and high poverty. And you can see that just by jumping around the different dots, the different schools on this tool. So what conclusions can I draw from all of this data? Number one is that the school district remains highly segregated by class and race, although not as badly as the US or California, although it has more extremely high poverty schools than the US. I didn't get time to show that. I wanted to point that out. A realistic goal is to reduce extreme group-based disparities. Now, there's a lot of debate about equity, and I have some slides that I can show later on if we want to get into it and what equity is and what the difference between equality. I think it's generally accepted among educational researchers that the extreme disparities that we see in test scores and graduation rates, in all the sort of objective metrics of educational outcomes can be reduced among groups. Now, there's a debate as to whether those disparities can be entirely eliminated, but I think it's clear, and there is agreement that we can make progress in reducing those disparities. But here's my main finding. Based upon the foregoing research, I think it's clear that the school district cannot really make progress either towards eliminating or reducing class or race-based disparities in a segregated school system by race and class, with a bunch of high poverty schools on the one hand that tend to be students that have disproportionate concentrations of students of color, and lower poverty schools on the other that tend to be disproportionately white. You simply cannot make progress reducing those disparities, even if you do a lot of investments in those high poverty schools. The disadvantages are so concentrated that you would need an enormous amount of resources, not just sort of maybe a 2-to-1 ratio, but possibly a 6 or 7 or 8-to-1 investment to even come close to creating equity. And so there's a lot of problems. This is the fundamental problem, is that the school district is segregated because the neighborhoods are segregated. That's a fundamental problem for California. It's a fundamental problem for the country. And you need to use gerrymandered student assignment policies to overcome that segregation. So here are my recommendations. Number one, This is the most important recommendation. I think the district has to cap poverty levels in all SFUSD schools. So if the overall student body is 50% low income, you cannot have a school on the one hand that's 20% poverty and another hand that's 90% poverty. You're going to have to find a cap that really makes sure that you have some diversity of SES in the school and reassign students. So you just can't have a successful school if you have 90% of the children earning below the federal poverty line, their families earning below the poverty line. Number two, I would reprioritize racial integration through student assignment policies, and school site selection. This is not just about integrating students by race, but it's also about deconcentrating poverty as well. And then finally, we need to move beyond equality in distributing resources. Even where we have equal resources, it's not going to be enough to really reduce these group-based disparities. And we need to provide more resources at high need schools than are provided in high poverty performing schools. I had one more recommendation also. This is more of an add-on than a specific recommendation. I think there are a lot of other things the school district can do. In the earlier part of my career, I used to focus a lot on these policies, on disciplinary policies, on curricula, on teacher training and retention, on school counseling programs. On school climate, there's a lot of additional policies that I think need to be looked at. But the point I just want to make here is that they have to be secondary to these other things that I mentioned at the top on capping poverty and racial and class integration. Because anything you do on these secondary tranche of policies, and they can be quite important, by the way, I don't want to diminish them or minimize them. It's just going to be trying to compensate for the fundamental problem created by concentration of poverty and racial segregation. It's sort of like, if you've got a rotten Christmas tree and you put stencil and air freshener on it, it's not going to really solve the core problem. You need to address the core problem as well as do these other things. So I'm stopping there. Thank you so much for your time. This is a very important conversation, and I'm really honored to be a part of it.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen, for sharing that with us. That is such astonishing data when you put it all together like that, just the connection with race and class and equity. And what does that mean then for why we're seeing certain schools have lower performing outcomes? And a lot of that ties to the concentration of race and therefore poverty in certain schools. One of your recommendations was to assess the actual need, and you mentioned like a 6-to-1 or higher ratio so that some of our high poverty schools had enough resources to level the playing field. What are you seeing coming up in some of these needs assessments, either like specific resources they need or kinds of funding that's going to be required so the students have a chance to get similar academic and life outcomes?
Do you want me to answer that now or wait?
Yeah,
okay.
You can go ahead.
Well, there are a lot of factors. One is that generally the research shows that teachers in disadvantaged schools and low performing schools tend to flee. And so keeping the best teachers in the highest needs and most disadvantaged schools has to be a priority. And part of the way you do that is by giving them incentives to stay there, right? Higher pay, more support, et cetera. Number two is capital investments. There is a powerful relationship between the quality of the school infrastructure and both educational outcomes and whether teachers want to stay there, right? Teachers don't want to be in a school that's got rats or mold. I mean, the horror stories from Newark and Detroit and around the country about the capital problems in school, and specifically in school buildings, older school buildings. Number three is additional services and supports like school counselors. The American Counseling Association recommends, I think, that there be at least one school counselor for every 250 students. I think in California, it's closer to one for every 750. School counselors are sort of like the forgotten chess piece, where what they can do is they can coordinate problems in schools and help children socially, emotionally, and with teachers figure out strategies for addressing problems. In secondary education, school counselors are just overwhelmed with trying to help students figure out if they're going to go to college, what their vocational options are. they don't even have the bandwidth to deal with the climate issues, the social group dynamics that often manifest, especially in diverse school districts. So I think there's so much that we need resources to go into. Those are 3 places I'd probably start, but you could also do, look, advantaged school districts and advantaged schools are able to pay for all sorts of extracurriculars, arts, drama, sports. I was reading an article this morning about how in LA, the school districts, affluent school districts raise literally tens of thousands of dollars, often several $1,000s per student in private resource to supplement education, creates even more inequity. So it's more than I could possibly get into now, but those are 3 or 4 places I would start.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. That's helpful to hear. I think there's a lot that we could possibly do to, while the policies to shift how students are assigned is underway. And I know SFUSD is working on that to create different zones with more equitable distribution of students. Possibly reinvesting in some of these ways could be a way to balance things until the broader core issue gets resolved. Debbie, question for you. I know what Stephen is sharing about kind of both national, state, and SF data is really astonishing. You know a lot about the history of some of these structural inequities in the history of San Francisco schools. Can you tell us more how this data shows up and plays out in our city?
Yeah, thanks, Stacey. Stephen, that presentation was really compelling, and I'm still sort of digesting the data. And my reaction is first that this segregation doesn't exist out of nowhere. San Francisco public schools are segregated today because they were segregated at the beginning. So if we go back historically and think about the gold rush, San Francisco is the urban epicenter of the gold rush. And as early as 1850, we have a segregated school system being created here in San Francisco with schools for white kids and a single school for African-American students. By 1860, the California legislature enshrines in law San Francisco's approach to having different schools for different kids. So if you go into Google and you type in California School Law of 1860, you'll see that all of California's schools were required to be segregated, with white kids taught separately from Native American, African American, and Asian American kids. And the actual language of the school law is so offensive, I won't actually read it here, but you can search it up and see the actual terminology used by our elected officials back then. So not only were the schools supposed to separate kids into different schools, the state of California would not pay to educate students of color per the school law of 1860. It left it up to counties to pay for the education of non-white students. So I know that for me, my jaw kind of dropped when I first read the statutory language, because I had always associated segregation and the ills of segregation with, schools, states in the South, but it's here in California, it's here in San Francisco. So there's been a century and a half of parents of color trying to overturn segregationist laws and policies. I won't go into all of them, but it takes until 1947 for the school law of 1860 to be overturned and for desegregation to become policy here in the state of California. And then obviously in the US, Brown v. Board of Education is handed down in 1954. So in San Francisco, following Brown v. Board, you get families in the eastern side of San Francisco where schools have been underfunded for a century, primarily attended by students of color, trying to enroll their students into the west side of the city, and the overwhelmingly white families on the west side of the city protesting any changes to enrollment policies. So this might start sounding like a familiar dynamic to those of us here in San Francisco who follow certain education policy debates. And there's a question in the chat about the consent decree. So in the intervening years, post-Brown, there were multiple efforts to integrate schools in San Francisco, but by 1983, it was not, they were unsuccessful. San Francisco Unified was subject to a court-ordered consent decree to desegregate, and has obviously, per Stevens' numbers, struggled ever since, even with the existence of that decree, to adequately integrate our schools. I just wanted to say that even if we were to disaggregate some of the sort of school level data within San Francisco that Stephen shared, we would see that even the quote unquote diverse schools often contain separate educational tracks where there is a general ed program that is primarily attended by students of color, and then some kind of language immersion program that would be attended primarily by white and Asian American students. So even in schools that statistically look integrated, you still see school sites that are in effect segregated. So I'll just stop there. Yeah, as we dive deeper into what we think about in terms of how segregation plays out in our schools, there's just so many layers.
Yeah, I think, Debbie, it's really fascinating to hear like all the different history and the back and forth and the attempts that have been made, but yet our starting place was that segregated. What does that then look like to try to pull that all together? And the connection between poverty levels and then ability for kids to access quality education, resources, teachers who are staying many, many years and highly trained, even to your point, like all of that just becomes so scarce in those communities. So Don, we're talking a lot about the different policies, and as mentioned, I know SFUSD is working more broadly on a different enrollment policy that will kick in 2024-25, and we'll do a future webinar session about that too. But I think that's something that's a broader, longer term effort. It's going to take years for that to play out. I know your office is really focusing on how do you address the inequities day to day of what kids are experiencing, because there's the structural systemic inequities and there's the daily interactions kids are seeing and experiencing as children. Can you talk more about some of what you are working on to address some of the inequalities our kids are experiencing?
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, I think that's actually what was coming up for me quite a bit. Was I'm also still wrestling with the data that Stephen presented. Amazing work, by the way. I'm also having a few flashbacks when I was a dean and doing my best to like put in these systems for students. Because I was actually working at a high performing high school in SFUSD. But as a dean, the students who were often in my office were coming from those low poverty environments, or high poverty environments throughout San Francisco. And what I noticed immediately was, Dean Frazier, we appreciate you trying to put these things in place, but we need help now. Like, there was a sense of urgency. And so this is also what I'm still seeing today, a very, very high sense of urgency. And what we're also seeing, and very much so in support of, and Stacey, actually, you brought it up earlier, which students are coming back from this distance learning and a year or two behind, and still having to deal with poverty on top of other layers of trauma. And some teachers are really trying to get students back into this academic framework where majority of teachers are saying, no, feel safe again, right? We need to create an environment where we're able to talk about things that we're experiencing. And so that's what we're seeing a lot of. And so even the conversation around poverty and integration, to your point, this is a very, very long-term thing. And so what do we do now? And when we talk about outcomes and what do we want for our students and our teachers, not just our students, but our teachers also, is what do we want? More than anything else that we want students and teachers to feel that they have a place of belonging, to Stephen's point earlier, that they feel included, that they feel safe, that they can talk about things that they're experiencing. How do we do that? A lot of the work that we do is centered on needs assessment and doing our best to create protocols, policies, and procedures around what's needed from this particular team that we're working with, or department that we're working with, or a group of students that we're working with. Outside of the needs assessment and the policies and procedures that we develop, we do a reassessment, right? Because for each student or each team that you work with, the needs are different. In relation to us understanding the members of the team or the department and their needs, there's also supports that need to be identified. And there's usually 5 supports: financial, spiritual, emotional, mental, and practical, right? And so when you break those 5 supports down, how often do we ask students, hey, what do you need? Now, we do ask those things, you know, they, hey, so what do you need? And usually, you know, as an adult, we barely know what we need sometimes. But what I truly believe in, what we do on our team, is we slow down and we talk about these needs. Some, you know, some people need, I need a sense of adventure. I need autonomy. I need creativity. Okay, great. What supports do you have in place? Is your teacher able to support you in these things? So now when we take another step back and we ask ourselves, are the administrators privy to the practice that we're bringing to the classroom? And so before we even continue to work with departments or teams, we make sure that there's an administrator that's on board. With the teams that we work with, we do our best to have a diverse population of people that are on the team. For example, we would still work with them, but we hope that there's a teacher, a counselor, a para, an administrator on the equity leadership team that we work with. Now, the barrier, one of the many barriers that we're seeing is time. There's just never enough time for it. So that moves us to take another step back and say, okay, so within the time that we have, very similar to this conversation now, we have long term, but within the time that we have now, what is it that we can do? And the hope is the educators that we work with, they can begin to see themselves as practitioners, right? And their students are actually bringing in data every single day. And how am I, as a teacher, as a 4th grade teacher, as a 5th grade teacher, high school teacher, how am I creating an environment where students are sharing live data with me for me to interpret that, process that, and actually create an environment for them to say, okay, I'll be okay today, right? I don't know if I'm going to pass this class or not. I don't know if that's what I should be focused on right now. I'm actually dealing with a lot at home, but I do feel okay coming to school right now. Those kinds of things do get looked over. And when I say looked over, I don't mean like by everyone, but when we talk about certain data points, those kinds of things do not get measured. Some of the students that you all are probably familiar with are probably dropping off their 2 siblings at their schools before they even make it to school, right? And so there are some life skills that are not being measured when we talk about academic process or academic progress that maybe should be considered. So there's also this character development that's not emphasized in the ways that we think it should be. And we know that's out of our control. However, with all of that said, we are seeing, and I think it's called street data, yeah, we're seeing the importance of students being the resource of their own learning, and us doing our best to work with the educators to create an environment for students to also see that and grow from it.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Don. I know one of the questions we have in the Q&A was like, even if we did take this, as we take the suggested approach of racial integration of schools, how do we create inclusive communities? And I think the work that you're talking about is how we get to that, right? Like beyond the structure and who's going to the schools, how we're creating the experience of school so that every child feels seen, a sense of belonging and cared for, and understood is going to be so critical so that they're not getting marginalized within a school that was designed to actually be supportive of them as we shift towards that. Steve, I wanted to pass it to you. There was some questions about realities of doing work around integration and so on. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, it was a great question. Let me see if this is working. Can you see my slide again?
Yes.
So just very quickly, this is a school district that I worked with in the late aughts in New Jersey. And I just want to show you, just absorb this for a minute. This is the map of this district called Montclair, New Jersey, just north of New York City. And it's basically a heavily segregated Black, about 66% white, 33% Black district. And you can see from the census tracts and they're like, here are the schools. If the schools replicated the neighborhoods, you would have this extremely white school in the north part of the district and this heavily black school in the south part of the district. But they used a magnet school policy to create integration. And then we actually created, this is the policy I designed, which was a zone policy, which sounds very similar to what San Francisco is about to do. And it was a race conscious plan. One of the factors was the racial composition of the neighborhood. And I just want to point out that Berkeley actually adopted a very similar version of this, where they created these diversity zones, and then they crosshatched them to create student assignment feeder plans and boundaries. And someone asked, is this legal? There was a lawsuit against the Berkeley plan, and it went all the way to the California Court of Appeals, which concluded that it was legal because it doesn't use racial classifications. It just considers the student's race. It does not consider the student's race. It considers racial demographics at the neighborhood level. But the point I just want to make and drive home here is that Debbie made the point that the San Francisco schools are segregated because they were designed that way. And I would say that that was definitely true in the early years of the district, but it's mostly actually that schools are drawn from neighborhoods that are segregated. And now, of course, there's a large governmental role in creating and sustaining neighborhood segregation, but much of that is now de facto. And so if you just have, for example, in Bayview Hunters Point, a historical Black community or other communities of neighborhoods of color in the district, and you just create schools in those neighborhoods that replicate those demographics, you're going to have a segregated school district like Montclair here would have had, without a countervailing attendance plan that tries to disperse, or as you call it, gerrymander students. You're just going to have both class and racial segregation. Now, I just want to make one last point. Don said that this is a long-term project. You can design an assignment policy that goes into effect the next year. You can make it more aggressive. In my experience, the reason that they phase in these assignment policies is because it's disruptive to move people who are like in third grade to a different school for fourth grade. And you also often want to keep siblings together. So what happens is you have all these competing needs and priorities. And ultimately, it's a district level decision on how much you want to prioritize deconcentrating poverty and racial integration. And if you make that your overriding priority, you can implement these almost overnight, within a school year. That happens at a speed that just like any of these other policies. The problem is the districts almost never want to do anything on that level of speed. So it's ultimately a decision for the parents, the community, and the leadership in the district.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I think that is so true, right? It's one of those, you can only change as fast as people are willing to change. And so even though the science and research design is there, how fast the district can actually put something like this into place will really be dependent on the community's ability to accept the rate of change and the personal change of like, I have to send my kid across town. What's that going to look like? Like there's going to be implications at the personal level that will be a trade-off of, personal versus greater good that people will have to consider. I know we're almost at time, so thank you, Stephen, for kind of sharing that final point. I want to invite Debbie and Don as well. If we have lots of conversations and lots of questions about how we get there. It's, I think we talked about the reallocation of resources, which will be a conversation we'll have in 2 weeks. We're going to bring on this whole reassignment team to talk in the next couple of months as well. But for this conversation around education equity and how it intersects with race and class, can you talk about what you want the audience to leave with, either a key idea or a key action they can take? Where do you want the audience to be leading this conversation with? Debbie?
Yeah, I think for me, just listening to Dawn, to Dr. Frazier, and to Stephen, I feel more aware of the scope and the complexity and the activities that are currently underway to address this issue more now in the last hour than I was the hour before. And so I think awareness, all of us as parents, as San Francisco residents and voters, as caring adults in general, just staying as up to date as possible through panel events like this one, for me at least, is something that I feel is doable and can help inform me in my conversations with friends and peers. I also think that if we have the ability to volunteer and work with our neighborhood schools, learn about what's happening in our community schools, or volunteer in a school that is currently attended by students of color that are high poverty schools, come and get involved at the San Francisco Education Fund. We have a robust and incredibly successful volunteer program. And you can see the amazing work that's happening on the ground every day here in SFUSD. And yes, attend our second panel event.
Yeah, thank you, Debbie. Don, let me pass it over to you. Any final words of advice or takeaway you want for our audience here?
Yeah, I actually just like to echo Debbie's sentiment of just being aware about what's going on and the ways in which you can contribute or challenge or help be a part of the process to change what it is that we're trying to change. And also keeping in mind that even us sitting on this panel, like we often make these generalized statements, and the reality is like one school's situation doesn't apply to the next. And so just being really aware about what's going on at particular schools throughout the school district, I think can be extremely helpful as well. And identifying how you think you want to be involved, even as just a listener, may be a great start. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you. Stephen, any final words from you?
Yes, I just want to emphasize that, schools, the problems and challenges that manifest in schools are byproducts of our society. And we put a lot on schools. Schools can't solve structural racism and systemic inequality. And we ask teachers and administrators to do a lot, right? To address trauma that happens in neighborhoods, poverty, intergenerational disadvantages, and so on and so forth. All of that is true. And yet, schools are the one place where we actually can make one of the biggest differences. And therefore, I think we have to. And what we can do is reduce a lot of these extreme intergroup disparities. And we not only can do that, but we have to do it. If we want to really reduce structural, begin to address and unwind structural racism in our society. Schools are one of the few places where we can actually have leverage points, where we have the ability to intervene in these processes. But I just don't think we can do it when you have high poverty schools that are mostly students of color, attended by students of color on the one hand, and low poverty schools that are predominantly or more heavily white on the other. It's just impossible to really make a huge difference in reducing these extreme disparities. You can tinker at the edges, there's a lot you can do, but you can't ultimately fundamentally change that dynamic in a highly segregated by race and class school system.
Yeah, thank you. I think Stephen, it's a big problem. It's going to take a lot of collective will to make that change to actually happen when the policy comes into play. Thank you all so much to our panelists today. This is a really enlightening and deep conversation. And I think what everybody is saying, for our audience here, please continue to stay aware. Please continue to learn more when these type of policies comes your way. I hope you'll have a better sense of what they're talking about and why this is important to support or engage in some way. As Debbie has alluded to, we're going to have more conversations. I know Stephen mentioned the resource reallocation and how that can help. And we're going to talk in 2 weeks about the financial structure and crises at the district and why that's been challenging. And then sometime next month or in March, we're going to re-engage the enrollment team to talk about the new student assignment policy that is going to try to create more racially equitable zones across San Francisco as a way to combat education inequities. So thank you again, everyone, so much for being here. We look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks and have a great rest of the week.